makes someone remarkable? Is the college application process fair? Do you mind being described as the white people whisperer? What is the optimal age to get married?
You start to find the non-obvious way kind of works.
Is there like a cartoonist community?
That year was the first year that we ever heard a teacher talk about race.
So many times when we go live with these things, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Boom.
So Ellen, the first place I wanted to start is with the origination story for the book, because I think it's such a fascinating way of connecting with the author. So take us back to that event, 2018. You're in the audience, I think, and you see something that really inspires you. And you've written multiple books before, and you wanted to do something different with this one. So tell us about that story.
It was a beautiful night, a spring night, not unlike now, a little colder maybe. And there was an event organized at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, an incredible historic art school. And it was organized by these two wonderful young designers, Valentina, Vergara, and Farah Cafe. And it was about women in graphic design. And actually, I was on a panel that they organized. And I trekked out there, not knowing what to expect. Like, what was this going to be like? It was these students, these graduating seniors who had invited me. And I was like, I've got to say yes to students. But I really didn't know what to expect. And the event was in a gorgeous auditorium at Pratt. And the audience was filled with people, mostly young people, who had come from all over, not just from Pratt, but there were students from Cooper Union saying hi to me. And there was a young woman who came up from Baltimore, which is where I live full time. And she had taken the train up to see this event that Valentina and Farah had organized.
So there was some buzz happening right there.
There was so much energy. And the panel was, I think, about 4 women on the stage answering questions. Farah was shooting questions at us and Valentina. And we were just talking about, mentors and our experience being women in the industry. I was the oldest one, but, there was a few other ladies, but some very young women, which was so cool. And then after the panel, there was a Q&A. And people were so passionate to ask questions, and not just ask questions, but tell their story. Like, there is a young trans designer who stood up and said that it was so hard for her to go to work where she was perceived as a man and as the wrong gender, and that she wanted to live in a world where she could be the same person all the time. It was like heartbreaking. Yeah. And then international students talking about being immigrants and the incredible anxiety that they feel going to this fancy art school but not knowing what their future is working in the U.S.
Yeah.
It was an amazing evening. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because you have all of these diverse perspectives in the same room. And something in your head says, I should figure out a way to turn this into a book. So, talk about that as your output, or at least your inspiration for that. Because, you've done multiple books before. Everybody else is sort of jumping into this as a relatively new project. And then, Valentina, I want to jump to you because I have a specific question for you about what you were working on before, which I think is so interesting. But Ellen, talk about why you felt like this needed to be a book.
Well, I love books. I've written a lot of books, and my most successful books are ones that really speak to an audience, to people that want to use them. Mm-hmm. So I write books that are meant to be kind of in the world. Like, I love when I see somebody with a beat up copy of a book and not like a perfect brand new one.
Well, you'll love this. My copy's not beat up, but it does have, a lot of these tabs across the side for all the things that I saved.
Love that.
So it's not beat up yet, but, perhaps in a year or two it will be.
I love books, and I think books can have a place in people's lives. And it interests me. A lot of young people like my books, I think, because they're practical. And when I had this idea, I was like, I can't do this book myself because I'm not a young person. And I want to like collaborate with other people who can help me, and help be the voice of the book.
It does have, I mean, you mentioned practical. The book is absolutely filled with really practical things. I mean, even to the point of, I mean, there's an entire section on how to come out at work, how to write a good cover letter. I mean, how to succeed in an internship. I mean, this is very, very practical stuff for somebody who's getting into the design field. And Valentina, you're on the younger side of getting into the design field, and you talk a lot in the book about your experience being in a design program where the students that you saw were very much like you, but the teachers and the professors were not. And it inspired you to create a couple of different things. I mean, you talk about Led by Example, which is one of the programs that you created. So take us inside sort of what you found as maybe a disconnect in that experience and what led you to this event that Ellen mentioned, and also just doing work in this space.
Yeah, definitely. So at Pratt, it was a project with me and Farah Cafe, and we quickly noticed that as seniors, like about to graduate, there was not a lot of female professors, especially like women of color female professors. And that was something that was really important to us because we weren't seeing like people who could lead us by example, which is where the name of Led by Example comes from. So we decided to do something about it, and it started off as an idea of having an exhibition where we highlighted women throughout history that we didn't learn about. Like basically the only woman that we knew about was Ellen Lupton through her book Thinking with Type. That was it. So we just did the research, we put together this installation, and then our mentors started to like ask us like, why don't you reach out to people that are currently working in the industry? Like, why don't you like take this outside of Pratt and like think of having maybe a panel discussion? And so when Farah and I were thinking about that, we were like, okay, cool, we'll have it in a little classroom. We'll ask our professors who are like the few women who are working at Pratt who are professionals. And we're like, you know what, let's reach for the stars. Let's ask Ellen Lupton, the writer of like the one book that we know, if she can be on this panel. And to our surprise, she said yes, which was amazing for us. And we also reached out to 3 other women who are Carly Ayers, who used to run a studio called Haraf. We reached out to Tracy Ma, who works at the New York Times style column, and then Natasha Jen, who is at Pentagram. And all of the experiences that they shared with us on stage, like, really matched with our hypothesis on, like, why, like, what it is to be a woman in the industry. And it was just an amazing experience. And then a few months after graduating, Ellen reached out to us, and it was very much like a full circle, because what we were missing in our design education was a field guide for like young graphic designers. And so it's so exciting to be a part of this book now that is answering a lot of the questions that we had as seniors at Pratt Institute.
And it strikes me that it's so collaboratively done, but it really, one of the interesting things about it for me is how directly it tackles these really big issues. And one of the things, Kaleena, you write in the book, that the system of racism that positions white people as the standard pushes others to the fringes. And one of the things you were talking about was in that design program, and in all of these design programs, there's sort of what's seen as normal or what we learn, and then there's kind of the other styles. And now as a professor of design in a school, you have an opportunity to really rethink that and to offer a different way of being and of seeing for your students. So take us inside, like, what is your classroom like, and how is it different from maybe the quote unquote traditional design classroom?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I actually started teaching design about 12 years ago at an HBCU. It's the same HBCU that I attended in undergrad.
Just to make definitions for people, HBCU, to define it, just in case people don't know.
Yeah, of course. So HBCU is a historically Black college or university. And they service predominantly African American students. It is open to everyone, but they were established around a time where Black students really didn't have other options, and they just continue to serve as a really great, usually lower tuition cost option for many students. But I started to notice when I was teaching design that a lot of my students were doing really had an affinity for design styles and textures and colors and typefaces that were outside of what we traditionally teach in design. And I started writing about my observations and presented about it at a couple of conferences, and really wanted to understand, where we developed those aesthetic preferences. And I just became really fascinated with the idea that our cultural upbringing, our socioeconomic status, our identities play such a big role in the things that we're attracted to, and how oftentimes those things are not well received in mainstream design industry, or ad agencies, or that sort of space. And so so I talk about that in the book, and the things that I think we can do to elevate some underrepresented voices. Excuse me.
Now, do you see, how sometimes they talk about when people are in film and they work in the movies, they see oh, that character had that prop in the other hand in the last scene, and now they have it in the other hand. They see that stuff that nobody else sees. As a designer who's working in this space, do you see design? Do you see fonts where you're oh, that's so biased, or that has such inherent kind of bias built into it that most of us maybe don't see? And if so, how do we get better at spotting that, or at least becoming aware of it?
Yeah, so for me, it's really less of spotting kind of those problems, and more of recognizing exclusions. So the things that my students, for example, are really into, I don't see. I really don't see them out. I see the same kind of, the sans serif, the chunky, contemporary, typefaces. But those are oftentimes not the things that my students are actually drawn to. And so that's usually what I sort of notice, is just the spaces where we're not really included. And then again, I just, I think about the portfolios that my students put together, and then how those are received when they're going for interviews at, design firms, or they're rejected sometimes for, internships, because their design style really doesn't really fit the traditional narrative.
Yeah, that's so sad on many levels, because you think about just someone trying to find their way, especially as a designer, and trying to find their style, and having something that's unfamiliar to whomever the hiring managers are, and they sort of see that, and they don't appreciate it. They say that it's it's far outside of what they're used to. And I wonder obviously the book is highly tailored towards people in the design field, either aspiring designers or maybe hiring managers who are looking at hiring designers. Ellen, when you think about this book, what could a non-designer take away from it? Should a non-designer even read it? I guess that's a leading question. I mean, probably they should.
Yeah.
I did. But what should they take away from it? What lessons can a not designer learn?
Well, definitely. So a lot of the book is about issues in the workplace that are really common to everybody, especially in the U.S., because we talk about discrimination laws, which are specific in the U.S., but then a lot of the ideas really do transcend many, if not all, cultures. So, for example, the idea that women tend to do more of the housekeeping in an office situation, and perhaps they are expected to, or they feel like they want to be the helpful one and they want to make things look good or whatever, but somehow a pattern of expectation gets set up where people, who identify as women end up doing all of that stuff and are expected to. Even me, I'm in a part of the industry that has a lot of women, but if I'm at a meeting where there's a important man, it is just amazing how quickly they take over the conversation. and how accustomed they are to having the women in the room kind of serve in a support role, whether it's taking notes or following up on the details. Janet, you'll follow up on this. And so that's something that actually occurs in all industries, and that there's techniques that those of us who want to disrupt that power flow can do to amplify the voice of someone who is maybe younger or a person of color or new to the team who may be being overlooked. And that if you can become conscious of that, you can really use that person's name, refer to the idea that they brought up. There are things that you can do that seem really subtle that actually really enhance the power dynamic in the room.
Yeah, you talk about, in relation to that, you talk about the concept of emotional labor in the book, which I love, just measuring like how taxing that can be in relation to this sort of office housework or housekeeping. But you also talk about a topic that I think is widely discussed outside of the field of design, which is the confidence gap between someone who really feels like, yep, I can feel confident in this position to state my opinion and to stand behind it as who I am, and I feel like I'll get appreciated for that, versus someone who has to sort of apologize for it. And I know that now all of you are working with younger designers or designers who are working to build that into their portfolio, not of design work, but of just work, of how they work. What has been the secret to being able to have that confidence? And I don't know if it's different. Is it different for a designer than it is for anyone else? Because you're creating creative work, which to some degree, one of the challenges I know that designers have had is everyone has an opinion about design, right? Like, if an accountant puts together something and they do the numbers, like nobody else has an opinion. It's either right or wrong. Whereas, when you create a design, everybody's like, oh, can you try it with a little more red, or can you make it a little more corporate? Or like everybody feels like they've got something to say. So I have to imagine it's harder to just stand up there as a designer, male or female, and say, this is it. This is the design because I'm the designer.
Either of you
Kaleena, maybe you can jump into that one. Yeah, I realized I didn't direct that one. That was sort of a softball up there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, if you have the secret, I'm all ears because I'm still figuring it out. But I think that I know I can speak to my experience. Prior to teaching, I was an art director at an ad agency, and was really young, and my age, being a young woman, a young Black woman working in a space where there was literally no one else that looked like me. I felt, most of my memories of that experience have nothing to do with the work that I actually did. And much of it was about just the way that I felt, in that space, the meetings that I attended where I was uncomfortable or was unsure of sort of, other people's perception of me, wanting to be a part of that particular community, but always having questions, about whether I was there, for a particular reason or not, and so those sort of thoughts play into your mind, and they certainly affect, your confidence, or they affected my confidence, and we're all different. I mean, some people really love being center of attention, and that doesn't bother them. But if you're someone who's not like that, I'm a naturally sort of like reserved, almost shy at times person. And so if you're already sort of that way, your identity can really play a part in making you feel even more sort of isolated, in those spaces, which affects your confidence, So there were times that I did not contribute, ideas, and I had ideas, but I didn't speak up and sort of share those, just for fear, of just not saying it the right way, or not being, it being received, or even the idea not really being understood, by people outside of sort of my own, culture. So yeah, but I'm still trying to figure it out, even after all of these years.
Valentina, how do you tackle this challenge of being a younger designer, probably in situations where you're navigating the dynamics and dealing with people who are older than you are.
Yeah, a lot of what Kaleena just said, I'm like nodding my head because I feel that a lot. And I've come to realize, like, I recently learned what imposter syndrome means. And I've noticed that I and a lot of my peers, like a lot of just young women of color in like the design field, in any field, just like constantly feel like because there's not a lot of us in the room, like our voice might not be right. Like I'm always like second guessing if what I'm saying is like correct. But because I've become aware that this is something that's like systematically like in my brain because of society, I'm trying to like fight against it. So I'm constantly like trying to make myself feel better. Like I have a lot of like accolades and I deserve to be where I am today. So I need to like constantly remind myself of those things. But also
hey, your name's on the cover.
Exactly.
I mean, anytime you struggle with that, you'd be like, hey, right here.
I keep reminding myself I'm an author now. I'm like, that's something
that's
super
right.
unexpected. But also just like creating allies, like in every workplace I've had, just like people that are pushing you up and you're pushing them up, and like you can confide in them, you can like speak candidly with them. Like currently I'm in a job where I'm one of 2 women on the team, but most of the men in my team are constantly like lifting me up. There is no like hierarchy. There's like I'm in a very like privileged team right now because everybody is basically woke and on the same page of like we're all creatives here and we're all gonna have a voice together as a team. So I feel like I've reached the point where I just have like good coworkers, but there's been experiences where my coworkers aren't so supportive. But it is important to just have like at least one ally to talk about these things with and just make sure that you know who you are. And yeah.
That's great. I'm so glad you have that type of work environment too. I mean, it's so important. Ellen, do you think designers get enough respect in the world?
Never. You know,
and why not? I mean, why not?
A big part of design really is the communication around what we do. You know, you make the thing, but you really do have to then sell the thing, even inside your own team, you know, not just to a client. And so becoming confident and becoming sure of your own ideas is a really big part of becoming a successful designer. And the thing that we write about in the confidence chapter is that responsibility shouldn't be all on the individual. That confidence isn't just something that we feel inside of us and that is our inner emotion. It's actually projected on us by our boss, by the client, by the person sitting next to you. So that when I respond to another person and convey my confidence in them, then they become more confident. So it really is this exchange, and that's why, you know, Valentina referring to it as systemic. And Kaleena has a great essay on systemic racism, right? That we have systems in society that enable some people to have more confidence than others, right? That are grow up being told that they have the right to be confident. So we all can, you know, help grow our own confidence, but also to enable confidence all around us, spread it around, you know, and we're all guilty of like deciding who in the room you're going to ask for help. You know, we instantly make judgments about who are the competent people in a room when you need something, right? Who's going to assist you or who's in charge.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things that is great about the way that the book is organized is that it's all these different chapters that are really sort of standalone pieces of advice, and mixed between them are experiments and examples. And so I want to jump into some of those examples and some of the charts and diagrams, because I think they're just so interesting, because not only are they very quickly shared, but they're also very visually shared. So let's do a quick hit on some of them and showcase them. And we're going to show show everybody, for those of you who are watching the video version of this interview, you're going to show you what it looks like, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it. So the first one I want to talk about is the Zumba font, and whether it is an example of, well, it says in the book, but an example of cultural appropriation and why. So let's talk about the Zumba font. Who can take this one? Who remembers that part of the book? I don't know exactly who worked on what parts of the book, but hopefully one of you remember that.
Yeah, I'll grab that one. So that's from a little short chapter about cultural appropriation and about giving credit, and really about, in graphic design, pretty much everything we do builds on something that already exists. That's why design communicates, right? We all know Helvetica, so it comes with a whole message attached to it. But sometimes designers borrow things from other cultures. They make quotations from cultures that they don't belong to give a little spin, a little exotic flavor, whatever, to take that Helvetica down a notch. And so there's a typeface called Zumba, and I don't have anything against the typeface, but it's inspired by, Latin dancing.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's more about how it's marketed, maybe, than
it's
what
really,
the
it struck me
intended.
as a perfect example of intersectional appropriation, if you could have such a thing, because it was like all these different cultures all like intermixed into one font. It was crazy, but really interesting. All right, so next I want to go to a topic that makes me slightly uncomfortable, but that's probably a good thing, which is mansplaining. So there's a beautiful chart in the book explaining to men, I presume, whether they are mansplaining or not, based on very simple questions, and it's sort of a flow chart. So talk about the inspiration for that, and maybe what the response has been. I mean, I thought it was great.
Sure. That's a chart designed by one of our contributors, whose name I would have to look up because there are so many contributors in the book. So
Hold on, while you're talking, I'll look it up for you. So while you're talking, we'll do this live.
Okay, thank you. So I saw this chart designed by
Kim Goodwin.
I saw this
infographic by Kim Goodwin.
Okay, I saw this chart designed by Kim Goodwin, who's an incredible user experience designer and consultant, and I follow her on Twitter. And I saw this chart she did where she was inspired to explain what mansplaining is. And it's really cool because it's a flow chart. And so it asks the question, are you mansplaining? And you can follow along this flow chart and determine whether you are. And so one of the first questions is, did the person ask you to explain? And if they didn't ask you and you explained anyway, then yes, you are mansplaining.
Yeah, it was pretty simple, the chart.
Yeah, but there are more subtle ones, and why I like the chart so much is that it really did help me understand. So one of the other questions was, is this person more of an authority in the thing you're explaining than you are? And Kim Goodwin is used to being in a meeting and suddenly some dude is explaining to her some principle in user experience design, which she has written a book about. Yeah. So like,
we see examples of that on Twitter all the
this
time.
to me, right?
Yeah, I remember, like, there's examples on Twitter of, like, I wrote my thesis, like, somebody referenced my paper back to me, right? Like, we see those, and yeah, they go viral for a reason, but it does sort of indicate a couple of things. I mean, one is a lot of situations, men just assume that they have expertise when oftentimes they don't. But secondarily, they don't actually ask. So what was interesting about that chart was it presumed that you would actually know how much expertise the person you were talking to had, whereas I think a lot of men just wouldn't even know because they never asked in the first place. So the chart might break down in that situation a little bit, but the point is clear, which is you should ask, like you should know what it is. So that was a really good one. All right, I have another one for you. It was the intersectional view of racism. The intersectional view of bias, and it had racism as one of the elements: race, wealth, ability, and gender, and how intersectionally they compound upon one another. Which is a lot of times what people don't think about. They just kind of look at one vector and say, okay, I have, this one vector and that's it. So talk a little bit about that if you can.
Yeah, so this is a diagram in the book. It's drawn by one of our co-authors, Jennifer Tobias, who did many of the very complex, elaborate drawings that are all through the book. And her idea was to create an illustration of the concept of intersectionality, which was developed by a Black legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an incredible, theoretical person really writing about the history of the legal system. And Kimberly Crenshaw, in her original essay, where she invents the word intersectionality that is, now so many people use, but it's been around for a while, she's picturing a traffic accident where somebody is a woman and Black and is hit by the race traffic and the gender traffic. And that both of those things affect her legal status. And yet the law at the time that this article was written refused to see those two things as connected. So if you had an anti-discrimination suit, it either had to be you were discriminated against on account of being a woman, or you were discriminated racially. But the idea that those two things could compound with each other, the legal system had not accounted for. And she has very specific cases and stories which are incredible. But so in this diagram, we created this intersection that has race and gender and wealth and ability. And of course, the true intersection of life has even more, right, compounding things.
Right. Yep.
But we can only fit so many rows.
Yeah, it strikes me that that age, particularly when it comes to design, may be one of them. Just having come from the world of ad agencies, where you don't really see people who are over 40 in the agency anymore. Like they seem to disappear somehow. They go somewhere, but
yeah, it gets clipped on both ends, right?
Yeah.
The very young people have a hard
right.
time breaking in, and then over 40, go home, take care of your kids.
Yeah, or go off and do what I did, which is become an entrepreneur and do your own thing, right? Because you're just sick of it at that point. Valentina, when you think about design, I'm curious. There's a lot of talk in the book about the binaries, of gender binaries and other types of binaries of in font world, there's serif and sans serif. There's like a very defined binary there. Do you think that way when you approach design? And in particular, do you feel like there are designs or there are fonts that are clearly feminine or masculine, or is that just our perception?
I think, first, to answer the first question, I don't think I start thinking in binaries when I'm approaching design. I think it starts from like a point of research, and never do I ever think of like gender when it comes to it. But to answer the second question, inherently we do have like what Ellen was saying, like there's like a systematic like thing that we have been taught to learn of like the binaries that and when I say we, I mean like my generation's trying to break past that. We're trying to be more non-binary, more inclusive, and that I think is going to be reflected in like the coming years with typography. I'm personally not a typographic designer, but I do think that with like feminine versus masculine design, like that's a very blurry line right now. Like you might see somebody's design and you can't say like that's hyper feminine or that's hyper masculine, because like the line is just constantly being blurred. So yeah. I think that's something to look forward to.
Well, and not just in design. I mean, you're seeing that in retail spaces. I mean, toy stores, and no longer having boy aisles and girl aisles. Toys no longer being pink or blue. Like you're seeing that across our culture, I think, in a lot of ways as well. So maybe design reflects culture, or the other way around, right?
Yeah.
Kaleena, when you think about educating the next generation of designers, do you think that everybody should have some design training? And if so, like, how do we get to that? Like, even the non-designers, like, should they be trained to think like designers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if everyone should have like the technical training of a designer. I mean, I don't know, if there's, as much value in that as it is in like thinking about like problem solving, and thinking and being able to understand what value designers bring into the world and the ways in which we can, even the example you just gave about, the different colors for children's toys, and if the broader kind of audience understood the power of design, I think that would definitely benefit everyone. I'm not sure about kind of those practical, like, technical skills. I'm not sure if everyone understood kerning. Maybe the world would be a better place. I think we could probably argue that it would, but I
if
would
they did need to, they could probably pick up one of Ellen's other books, and that would
yeah.
explain it all for them. So,
I mean, I think designers would be happier if everyone else understood those things, but I think more than that, it's the social kind of like context of design and the conversation surrounding, the power of design that would be beneficial, for the wider audience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Ellen, I'll direct the last question to you because we've come to a close in our conversation. The book is Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. And I'd love to know from you, what do you hope will change in the world of design and designers as a result of this book having come out?
Well, I don't think this book will change anything. I think this book speaks to the change that's already happening and is being created by young people and people like Kaleena and Valentina and the other authors of this book, which is opening up the conversation around design to include more kinds of people. There's new histories of design being written that are exposing parts of the story that weren't celebrated before. I am just so optimistic for what the next generation is doing and knowing and what they're hungry for. And they're the ones that inspired the book to begin with.
That is a great inclusive answer. So thank you. A perfect way to end. So Kaleena, Valentina, Ellen, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me as part of our Non-Obvious Insights show, talking about the book, talking about all of your work. I really appreciate it. And I think it was just a fantastic conversation that'll be useful for a lot of people.
Thanks for having us on your show.
Thank you.